hands are never cold. She's got Betty Davis.
Hello there, and welcome back to the IBM Personal Computer 5150. So last time I explained what I want to do in this series, and that is to look at this machine that first came out in August 1981, which is the forefather of all modern personal computers, including laptops and desktops and servers, and which represent pretty much 99% of all computing power around on the world today. All started with this machine. And so what we're going to do is to try and imagine that we're in 1981, that we're a software developer or a programmer or just a computer enthusiast, and we have one of these machines, and we want to start using it. In particular, we want to start programming it, writing software for it, and seeing what kind of a programming environment this machine offers. And today we're going to kick off that process with one of the simplest programming environments which are available, which is BASIC, the BASIC language. So I also explained that we're not going to actually be using the hardware because I don't want to risk damaging vintage equipment because it is very sensitive. Just to try out some stuff in software, so we'll be using an emulator. And so here is a program called PCEM, which emulates the exact hardware of one of the configurations of the IBM Personal Computer. In particular, it'll emulate a system with 2 floppy disk drives and 64 kilobytes, yes, you heard that right, 64 kilobytes of RAM on the motherboard. It'll also be using a monochrome display adapter and a monochrome monitor, which the output of that monitor will show up in this window here. And so, as I also explained in the last episode, when you bought this computer, in order to start using it, it came with tons of documentation, with lots of big books, manuals. And the first one you'd probably want to read would be this one, would be the IBM 5150 Guide to Operations, which looks like this. So that's 250 pages of explanations about how to operate and run and use your personal computer. And it goes into some of the programming environments, in particular BASIC. So that's a good place to start. So let's just flip through this guide here and see what we can find. So it's divided up into several sections. Here's a nice table of contents. So there's an introduction about the computer system, how to set it up. So that'll be a lot of hardware setup. So where do you want to connect the keyboard, and how should you connect a monitor, and what you should be careful of, and etc. And then we'll get into the operations part. And so here we see immediately there are really 2 ways of using the IBM Personal Computer. You can either use DOS, the disk operating system, or you can use BASIC, which is the programming environment. And as you can see here, IBM is clearly pushing people to use DOS. Now, why is that significant? Well, when it first came out in 1981, and in the years like the decade of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, using an operating system was far from something that everybody did. Operating systems were mostly known for running on big time-sharing computers like mainframes or mini-computers, and one of their biggest jobs was to attribute resources and share them equally amongst the many users which were time-sharing one of those systems. Now, if you had a personal computer, and that's what was great about this IBM computer here, you don't really need to do any time sharing because you own the entire computer, and so there are not really any resources to share. They're all yours, essentially, was the thinking back then. And so why on earth would you need an operating system? You can just use the computer. And that was certainly the case on a lot of the personal computers that came before the IBM Personal Computer, and most of those would have used an 8-bit CPU, something like the Intel 8080, or the MOS 6502 or whatever it's called, which you could find in the Apple II. And a lot of programs would start up that computer and start running on that CPU directly. A little bit similar to what I did on my breadboard CPU. There was no operating system there. We just ran programs and turned it on, and the program ran. That was it. So the idea of using an operating system was not at all self-evident back in 1981. And IBM is clearly pushing you to do exactly that, to actually use the disk operating system. And it's mentioned first, even though in some ways it's actually a more complicated way of using the machine than simply using BASIC. And all of the programs that you could later run, which were already written, all the software, 99% of that required the DOS operating system to work. And so this is a kind of a seminal turning point in the history of computers, is where we're first starting to see a machine which really needs an operating system, even for a totally personal environment, to run any kind of programs. And of course, it turns out that that was a good idea, because today there's no such thing as a computer which doesn't have an operating system. Even an Apple Watch, which you wear on your wrist, a tiny little computer, has an operating system to run programs. And that idea started to see mainstream acceptance with this IBM Personal Computer. And you can see it right here in the manual, in the first edition, the way that they're pushing you to use DOS as it's the first option that's mentioned. And BASIC, you can use BASIC, but I think this is a subtle hint to say that, yeah, you can use bare bones BASIC, but please consider using DOS, and because we think that's the better way. That's how I understand this manual. So anyway, let's go further. So here's an introduction about what the hardware looks like, and this is explains to you what the diskette drives are and what the keyboard is and the monitor. And that might seem obvious to us today, but maybe that was not obvious to some people in 1981. You could attach a printer. IBM had a printer which was compatible with this computer. We're not going to be simulating that. We won't be using the printer. One reason why a printer may have been important in 1981 is that this screen, this monochrome monitor, which IBM sold, could show you a maximum of 25 lines at once. So if you're developing a program, those 25 lines, that's all you can see on screen. And you would probably, as a developer of more complex programs, want to see more of your program at once. And a simple way of doing that was to print it out. But we won't be using it. We'll actually be trying to write software using only the 25 lines of the display. Now, you didn't have to use IBM's monochrome monitor. We talked about that last time. You could also use a color graphics adapter, and then you could attach that to either a simple TV or some third-party monitor which was compatible with that color graphics adapter. And as we also discussed, if you didn't have any diskette drives, like this unit, you could attach a cassette player through a cable to the back of the computer, and you could actually run BASIC and load and save programs onto cassettes, which you could put into this cassette recorder. And so this, in many ways, is the most basic, in quotes, configuration that you could have. No diskette drives, probably very little RAM, maybe 16 kilobytes as the minimum of RAM, the keyboard, and no monitor. You would just attach an existing TV set to it. So you could use the computer in that way. Now we'll be simulating the actual monitor here, which is these are what the optional extras. So you can have a monitor, you can have a monochrome display adapter, which is what we'll be emulating for this monitor. You could have an optional printer. You needed a printer adapter. And it's an important point. To use any kind of equipment, peripheral equipment back in the days, required an expansion card, which you needed to install into your motherboard, and that included such banal things as a printer. That also included a floppy disk drive, or as in our case, 2 floppy disk drives, so they had their own adapter. You could attach a serial adapter and then talk to a modem and dial into remote systems. So yeah, all of this was considered optional back then. So the basic unit was just that: motherboard, a jack in the back to attach a cassette player, and a keyboard, and that's it. And 60 kilobytes of RAM. All right. So that is an introduction to what the thing is. Now here we come to the section about setting it up and what you need to do. So this is when you first unpacked it. You'd probably have to do all this stuff. You could have a look at the front, have a look at the back, where you need to attach the keyboard, all that stuff. Of course, we won't be doing any of this because we're emulating our hardware. But it's nice to know that IBM did a thorough job of explaining all of that to the novice user who's first using his computer. And here we come to, so you need to attach it to the power, and then we come to the exciting bit, which is actually turning it on. And one of the features of early PCs is that when some of PCs still do that today, when you turn them on, you will hear one short beep. And that means that the system unit has completed a self-test. And I can show that to you right now. So if I turn it on, this emulator emulates that behavior. So it's running a self-test, and when that completes successfully, it beeps, and then it runs whatever it's supposed to run. So the self-test was an important part of the startup procedure of the IBM Personal Computer. And what it does is check all of the hardware which is in the system. So it checks that the RAM is really there and is working, that you can read and write to it. It checks that it can access the disk drives. I don't know. It checks various pieces of hardware. It checks the processor, that it does what is expected, etc. And if that self-test were to fail for whatever reason, then you would hear some other thing apart from a short beep. And if this happened on your first turning on of the machine, then you should send it straight back to IBM. Okay, here's another view of the rear panel and where you attacked. These are where the expansion cards would go. So this system has, it looks like it has a parallel printer and a monochrome display adapter. So it actually had a parallel print port on the monochrome display adapter. This looks like a color display adapter. You could actually install both and use a color monitor and the monochrome monitor, although I don't know how many people have done that. So here's a more typical setup, and here's the keyboard. Okay, here's the monitor. You have brightness controls. It explains about the self-test again. Okay, and you should see the IBM Personal Computer, which we see here. Monitors, sometimes you needed adjusting. The display might be a little bit off to the left or to the right, so you could adjust all of that. This is a cathode ray tube, so this is all analog. These are electron beams, which are being directed by an analog voltage somewhere inside the monitor, and so it could happen that the text was off, and then there was some ways of fixing that. Okay, and so one of the first things you can do is you can load the diagnostic aids to check out your computer, and the diagnostic aids, they come on a diskette, which is in the back of your manual, this manual, the Going to Operations, and here it explains what you'd want to do to run that. So we can try and run that, because we can emulate diskette behavior. So we have no diskettes inserted in the drives now, but so I can insert this diagnostics aid diskette. So I'll load that into my A drive. So I've put it here under master. These are all read-only diskettes as images of the diskettes that you would have received, which I got from some of those sites I showed you in the first episode. And so we want the diagnostics diskette, which is this one. So let's load that into the A drive. Position the system unit switch to off. So we need to turn it off, really. So I'm going to do that by pressing this reset on the emulator and then pausing the machine. And there we go. And so now essentially it's off. And then we need to insert the diskette. So we did that. It's in the drive. We need to push down the lever. So you put it in, you actually have to press the switch down so that the diskette was secure inside the drive. And then the in-use light would light up when it starts reading the diskette, and so that would happen when you turn the power switch on. So let's do that. Let's turn on the switch. So we should again hear the self-test. There it is. And so now it's going to start reading whatever's on the diskette. And so here we get the diagnostics program. There was also a diagnostics version on cassette. So if you didn't have disk drives, you could run BASIC, or you could load the diagnostics program off the cassette. So here's an explanation of how you'd have to do that. You'd actually have to start BASIC first, and then you'd need to load the program once you're inside BASIC. And so that's something that you could do if you had a unit without any disk drives. Okay, and so this is what happens with diskettes. Here is the prompt we should see, and indeed that's what we see. So we see 1.0 copyright IBM 1981 diagnostics, and then a number of things we can do. And essentially it's already done the mini test, so that bit has been completed, and so it's suggesting that if we get this screen, that essentially means everything's fine. And so what it's telling us to do here is press, I think that's a 9, make that a bit bigger. Yeah, that looks like a 9. So it wants us, exit to system diskette. So that would mean I could probably put DOS in there or something like that, and then the diagnostics are essentially done now. So you can press 9 and press enter. So I'd need to insert a new diskette now. All right. So we've done the mini test. Now IBM recommends that you perform a complete system checkout. I guess that's what these are. These more advanced diagnostic routines. So yeah, I guess we'd need to do that. if we move the computer around, we stuck another expansion card in there or something like that, and make sure all the hardware is running. All right, so that's one of the first things we can do. So we've set it up. Our emulated PC is running. That's great. So now we can get started. So again, it goes through a whole lot of stuff here. Adjusting the monitor controls. Let's put that back to a reasonable size. Listening for the self-test. We've done that a few times now. And explains about the keyboard, because this is an important point. This keyboard, this layout, that's what the layout looked like back in the old days. Contains a number of keys, and not all of those keys are known. In fact, a lot of those keys are not known to people in 1981. So it has some very strange sounding keys, things like the escape key, or the tab key, or the control key, or the shift key, or the alt key, or the backspace key, or the enter key. All of these keys, to us, they're second nature, because they are on every single keyboard for every single PC out there. In fact, they're on most Macs as well these days. And there's one reason, and one reason only, why those keys have become so prevalent, and that's because they were on the IBM PC in 1981. So in 1981, these were very specific keys to the IBM Personal Computer. You bought some other personal computer from Tandy or whatever, or Commodore 64, whatever, they had totally different keys. And so this particular set of keys, which we're all used to today because they're on every single PC out there, started out right here on the IBM Personal Computer. And this manual explains what they are, because at the time nobody knew. And so yeah, this is where the escape key comes from. This is where function keys come from. Today's keyboards, they still have all the function keys, F1 all the way up to F12. Some of them have even more. Many software today doesn't use them anymore, but they're still there. And the reason they're still there is because IBM introduced them in the IBM Personal Computer. Notice also that the layout is actually not exactly what we'd expect today. So on a modern keyboard, these function keys, they'd all be along the top row here with the escape key. And the caps lock, which is over here on this keyboard, actually moved up to the left. So on a later model of the personal computer, I think it was the Personal Computer AT, stands for Advanced Technology, which came out in 1984. That one had a hard disk drive, and it used a 286 processor. That had a different keyboard, so IBM tweaked the layout and moved stuff around a bit. And essentially, the keyboards that we use today, they're all based on that AT layout of a keyboard. And so once again, IBM set the trend and essentially set the industry standard, which is observed until this day. So if you look at your keyboard right now, it's extremely likely that you'll see a row of function keys at the top here, an escape key, you'll find the enter on the right, you'll find a numeric keypad which is slightly offset, you'll find the arrow keys in the middle, and you'll find the shift and a caps lock, and all of these keys, except not exactly in that layout, you'll find them in the AT layout, and that's because IBM set the trend back in the early 80s. So yeah, I find that interesting information. Here is bindings of the function keys when you're running BASIC, and we'll get into that shortly. But so yeah, all of that was brand new on the IBM Personal Computer. Good, so a lot of explanations about the keyboard. Now I'm not going to go through all of this because, as I said, these keys are second nature to us now. So the fact that we can use the arrow keys and we can press Control and use the arrow keys, and all of what all of this stuff means, those have all become totally standardized because of their introduction here by IBM. Good, here's some more explanation about the printer. We're not interested in that because we don't have one, so we'll skip right through that. And then we come to the using DOS, and so we have a part about using DOS and a part about using BASIC. And we'll get to DOS in a future episode. I want to get to BASIC first. So we'll skip across all of that. Anyway, here is BASIC. So how do we start using BASIC? Okay, so your personal computer has 3 versions of BASIC. It's the first thing to know. There's Cassette BASIC, there's this BASIC, and there's Advanced BASIC. BASIC is a programming language. Cassette BASIC uses a cassette recorder to load and store files. And this BASIC uses diskettes to do the same thing. And Advanced BASIC does all of that, plus a little bit more than Disk BASIC. In fact, it has some extra commands. Now, the reason that there is this distinction is memory, essentially. So depending on how much memory you had, you could use a simpler or a more advanced version of BASIC. So to use the most advanced, which is the Advanced BASIC, you needed at least 48 kilobytes of RAM. And if you bought a system with only 16 kilobytes, there's no way you could run that. And so that's why there are these 3 different versions. Also, to run Disk Basic or Advanced Basic, you need a diskette drive. And if you didn't have one, then all you could do was run Cassette BASIC. Okay, so both Disk Basic and Advanced Basic run under DOS. So you need to start DOS before you can run those programs. And so they use DOS to manage the input and output from the diskettes. But if we want to just use Cassette BASIC, then we don't need the DOS, which is what is explained here. So Cassette BASIC does not run under DOS, and it does not use diskettes. So if your computer is off, then this is what we need to do. But our computer is actually on because we were still running this Diagnostics program. So let's see what happens here. So if your system has diskette drives, make sure there is no diskette in any of the drives. Well, the Diagnostics diskette is still in there, so we need to take that out first. So let's eject the Diagnostics diskette. Off it goes. And then here's a fun one. And then we need to do some magic. We need to press the Control key, the Alt key, and then press and hold them down. And then we need to press Delete. It's Control Alt Delete, which of course has become extremely famous now in 2020. But again, this is the first mention of this trio key combination, which of course has become iconic later in the computer age. But again, here, right in the manual, in the very first IBM Personal Computer, is where we see it appear for the first time. And so we do that to reset the computer. Now, if I just press Control-Alt-Delete right now on my keyboard, because the combination has in the meantime become so famous and so universal, I'm pretty sure my Linux host operating system is going to catch that and is going to mess up my desktop and my recordings. So I'm not going to do that. Unfortunately, once again, because the key combination is so famous, my emulator actually gives me a possibility of sending that key combination as if I typed it on the keyboard into the emulated IBM Personal Computer. And so that will emulate what I would be doing here. Alright, so we do that. And once again, we have the self-test. And now we actually have Cassette BASIC, just like the instructions told us. So that's great. And so for Disk and Advanced BASIC, we'll look at those later. So here's our basic environment. And here we see all the information. And it explains it to us that the D in this message tells you that we have Disk BASIC, but we don't have a D, we have a C here. And so the message may instead show a C for Cassette BASIC, which is what we have. And we have 64 kilobytes free. So BASIC itself, well, we have 61 kilobytes, so BASIC itself takes about 3. So you could run that on the simplest possible configuration with 16 kilobytes of RAM. Alright, so let's get started in BASIC now. We have a basic prompt, which is okay, that's great. If for whatever reason, once again, the screen should not be aligned properly with the display, that might happen because of the analog voltage inside the cathode ray tube here, then there are some commands which we can assume basic, but since we're in an emulator, it's working flawlessly, and so we don't need to do that. This will be interesting for later, but that's so all this is true when we're running Disk BASIC or Advanced BASIC, which you'll remember requires us to first start DOS. And so when we're doing that, then we can actually get back to DOS using this command, or we can show all of the files. But none of that will work in this BASIC because there is no DOS. So that's a syntax error. And so all these file commands, none of those work right now. Anyway, we have the function keys, which have assigned to them specific words which mean something in BASIC. And so, in fact, we can have a look at another book of part of the documentation, which is the BASIC book. We'll have a look at that in a minute, where we can find all the details about those keys. But very conveniently, and the program also shows them here at the bottom of the screen. So we have F1 is a shortcut to type list. So if I just type F1, that's the same as typing list. And here are all the others. And so here we're actually going to start programming. So if we want to, there are some samples which are on the DOS diskette, so that would need us to start DOS and then run BASIC from there. So we can't do the samples program right now, or any of these COM programs. or even from a different diskette. So all of this is essentially disk-based BASIC, but we can do this. We can start with a new program. And so we can type new to say we want a new program, and that will empty the memory of any program that might be there. And then we can just start writing a program. So let's write 10, print 1. Okay, that works great. 20, print 2. And 30, print 3. Now notice that nothing's happening. It's just accepting the lines. And now you have done entering this short program. Your screen should look something like this. Yes, and so the cursor is at the bottom. That's true. Now, we haven't run anything. To actually run the program, we need to type run. So let's do that. And what do you know? It printed 1, and then 2, and then 3. And that's it. We're up and running. We're programming. So if I now had a cassette, or if I were in this BASIC, I could actually save this fantastic program which I have here. And we'll be able to do that in a minute. But we can't do it right now because we don't have a cassette tape machine attached to our virtual emulator. We can change the program and have it do something else, or we could list everything that we've printed so far. So that shows us the program. Notice that BASIC converted all of these keywords to uppercase. So BASIC is essentially entirely uppercase, including variable names and all that. All right, and so this gives us a basic overview of what we can do in BASIC. But once again, this is not a basic manual, this is just a guide to operations. So if we want to understand more about programming in BASIC, there is a manual to do that, which is this BASIC manual. And that's another of the books that came with the IBM Personal Computer. And here it is. And this one's 500 pages with nothing but explanations about running BASIC. And so here's the table of contents. And again, we have the 3 versions, the cassette, disk, and the advanced BASIC. And then how to get it started. Now we've done all of that from the guide to operations, so all of that is repetition. And then we have essentially the whole manual, all of the commands and all of the statements and how you deal with variables and all that. And so we could go through that as a programmer in 1981 and start learning BASIC. And we discover that to complete our mission here, so let's start with a new program. If you want to print hello world instead of 1, 2, or 3, it's the same idea, we have print. But because it's a string, we'd learn by going through these 500 pages here, we'd learn that I have to actually write it in quotes, like that. And once again, that doesn't execute immediately, that simply stores it in a program. So if we list the program, there it is. But if we run it, then here we are. We have managed to print hello world on the screen in our very first programming environment, which is BASIC running directly from the ROM in the machine. All right, so that might not seem terribly impressive from this point of view, but I want to try and get across how extraordinary this actually is, especially for 1981. So let me turn off the computer again, just turn off the power switch, and show you what it means to start programming on an IBM Personal Computer 5150. Once I've gone through all the manuals and understand how things work, essentially what I need to do is turn on the power switch, wait for a few seconds, not minutes, seconds, and start programming. And I can write my programs as complicated as I want them. This, of course, is a very simple one. And I can run it right here and now, immediately. And that's it. I've written a program and run it, and I could discover mistakes in it and fix them. Supposing, I don't know, I want world, I want that in capital letters, for example. Well, I can do edit 10, and I can change that W, make it I need to press insert as well, right? You discover all that when you read the manual. And I can run it again, and there you go, I fixed my program. I haven't even been running for a full minute, and so this is pretty heavy stuff and heady stuff back in 1981. Remember my breadboard computer, what a hassle it is to get any kind of software in there. You need to put it in the dip switches, and then you need to reset all the registers, and you need to assemble it by hand somewhere in a completely different place. Now, stuff wasn't quite that bad with the personal computers which are around before the IBM Personal Computer, but certainly a number of them were a pretty big hassle to get running. Infamously, the Altair 8800 was one of the very first personal computers. That one didn't even have a screen. It was an option to attach a serial board in there and then attach a terminal to the serial board. But it had no boot ROM by default. You had to key in start programs using switches on the front panel, and then you had to load BASIC from a paper tape, or maybe if you were lucky from an 8-inch diskette, and it could take well up to 5 minutes before you could even start writing any kind of code. So looking at this, I would say that the IBM Personal Computer, as in its first iteration in 1981, provides a very comfortable programming environment if you want to get started, let's say, with a simple language like BASIC. And to illustrate that point, what I'm going to do is, so we have our Hello World running here. I want to revisit the program which I developed in the previous series to calculate prime numbers, and I want to try and get it running in this programming environment. So I already went ahead and produced a version in BASIC in reading this manual and finding out about all the statements. I myself haven't used BASIC very much in my career, so I definitely had to go through this manual again and find all the statements. What's more, there are plenty of dialects in BASIC, and so this BASIC which we see here is the BASIC described in this manual, but that's no longer true today. If you run Visual Basic today, the syntax has changed a little bit. So anyway, let me just get this program keyed in here. So I'm going to start new and then start typing it. All right, there we are. So I hope I didn't make any mistakes. We can list the program. We can see it's there, and let's try and run it. Yeah, so that seems to be working. And so there we are. We can, as I said, this is a programming environment which is very easily accessible. Essentially, all you have to do is turn on the machine, and there it is. And if you had a cassette drive, you could even save some of your programs and then work on them the next day. And so to start to learn programming, I think it's a very useful platform. Also, the level at which you're programming here in BASIC is nowhere near as complicated as what you would have needed to do to write in machine language assembler, or even in some higher level but more complicated languages, things like C. So I can well understand why this would have been a compelling offering to attract new people to the idea of computer programming. Anyway, so that's about as far as I wanted to go in this episode, and so next time we'll start using the very serious sounding program which is called the Disk Operating System, or more commonly known as DOS, and so we'll see what that offers for the programmer from 1981. So see you then.
And she'll tease you.